It was October of '62, a beautiful fall season in Cuba. Locals and tourists bustle about on the Caribbean island, ignorant to the looming disaster. It was the 25th when the United States dropped over 5 nuclear bombs on Cuba to protect themselves from a perceived Soviet threat. Now, Cuba is but a fond memory, for this Caribbean island ceases to exist today.
¿Qué te importa que te ame si tú no me quieres ya? El amor que ya ha pasado no se debe recordar. Fui la ilusión de tu vida, un día lejano ya. Hoy represento el pasado.
The footage you just saw is not real, but it very well could have been. The idea of complete nuclear holocaust during the Cold War, especially surrounding Cuba, was a daunting reality for decades. How did we let it get this far? As Los Cubanos ask, how does one tell the story of a country whose history is far larger than its size? We answer, you start at the beginning. In 1823, the U.S. announced their formal relation to Cuba with the Monroe Doctrine. This doctrine proved helpful in gaining Cuba's independence, which happened as a result of U.S. effort in the Spanish-American War of 1896. Their part played in Cuba's liberation, as well as this doctrine, gave America a sense of entitlement over Cuba, or at very least some level of kinship. This entitlement went so far that the United States occupied Cuba for almost a decade after the fact, until the Republic of Cuba was declared around 1901, and even then, the island stayed a U.S. protectorate until '34. The Platt Amendment in 1901 furthered the U.S.'s control over Cuba, giving them the right to intervene if they saw the need. It was clear through all these measures that the U.S. had no intention of letting Cuba slip through her fingers.
Though originally rooted in the fight against a common enemy, the 1950s saw the once amicable Cuba and the US turn into bitter ideological foes, contributing to the changing tensions of the Cold War. The push of Cuban action, continuously provoking American reaction, eventually led to the severing of diplomatic ties between the two, pushing Cuba into the open arms of fellow communist nation, the USSR. When Fidel Castro overthrew American Allied President Fulgencio Batista in 1950, the U.S. was forced to recognize Castro as Cuba's new leader, despite his openly anti-American and leftist ideology. Castro's nationalization of U.S.-owned businesses in Cuba shortly after his entry into power pushed the U.S. to respond by cutting economic aid to Cuba, imposing trade quotas, and proclaiming an embargo, one which is still in place today. Castro thus found an economic and trade ally in the USSR. As a result, the period of the 1950s was seen as one of increasing Cold War tensions, with Cuba becoming US's communist threat in the Western Hemisphere. Beneath the US's open opposition to Cuba, the US Central Intelligence Agency was engaging in plans to overthrow Castro. It had been secretly training anti-Castro Cuban exiles with the hopes of using them to overthrow Castro in a popular revolution. Though the CIA believed that many Cubans were not in favor of Castro, the reality was that Castro's Cuba was positively received for the improvements it had brought Cubans in literacy, public health care, and reducing racism. As a result, lacking both the manpower and the support of Cubans, the Bay of Pigs failed to overthrow Castro. Instead, it highlighted Castro's domestic support and led to an embarrassed U.S. nation. Additionally, the USSR denounced the Bay of Pigs as a counter-revolutionary U.S. threat. leading to Khrushchev's decisive move of secretly bringing missiles into Cuban territory. These early tensions between the US and Cuba were furthered in the Bay of Pigs operation, which eventually led Cuba to pursuing closer ties with the USSR. As a result, by establishing itself as a communist force in the Cold War, Cuba posed an immediate threat to the US in its proximity to the capitalist superpower. Such a proximity would become a crucial aspect of the fear Americans felt in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Now your leaders are no longer Cuban leaders, inspired by Cuban ideals. They are puppets and agents of an international conspiracy which has turned Cuba against your friends and neighbors in the Americas and turned it into the first Latin American country to become a target for nuclear war. We know that your lives and land are being used as pawns by those who deny your freedom.
Between the 16th and the 28th of October 1962, the world stood on the brink of the edge, waiting for the resolution of what would be named the Cuban Missile Crisis. With the presence of Soviet-delivered nuclear missiles in Cuba, leading the U.S. to respond with a military quarantine and the demand that the weapons be removed. The Cuban Missile Crisis consisted of 13 days, when the whole world held its breath. Unsure of whether or not they would be safely guided out of conflict, or if the world would be plunged into a nuclear holocaust after U.S. discovery of Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba.
That a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The U.S. used naval quarantine to pressure the USSR and Cuba into disarming, while Castro urged Khrushchev to use nuclear weapons against the U.S. in case of invasion. But luckily for everyone, there was no such case. Thanks to exchanges between leaders Kennedy and Khrushchev, the crisis was ultimately resolved with an agreement stating that the missiles would be removed on the condition that the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba.
With the aversion of a full-scale nuclear war, the whole world emerged successful from the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, amongst its major players, the US, the USSR, and Cuba, there were both winners and losers to the conflict. Of these winners stood the US, which, along with avoiding a nuclear strike, had regained its credibility as a force which was willing to negotiate with its enemies not only via political discussions, but also through military threats. At the time, the USSR was seen as a loser. Khrushchev had been seen as a leader who had conceded to the US, which would contribute to his eventual fall from Soviet power. However, unbeknownst to the public, the USSR was in fact a winner in its secret agreement with the US to remove missiles in Turkey. For Cuba, the US and the USSR had largely influenced its participation in the crisis. For example, Castro had not even been consulted by Khrushchev on the settlement with Kennedy. Having lacked a strong role in the negotiations, Cuba resolved to establish its own independence as a player in the Cold War. It would become a hub for revolutionary activists and become an active player in spreading revolution to Africa and Central America. Cuba would continue to influence the Cold War through its military and financial aid to leftist guerrilla movement in Latin America and Africa from the 1960s to the 1980s.
Being pushed the closest to the brink of what both sides equally feared, the threat of nuclear action as a form of Cold War aggression became a serious reality in global warfare. The game had evolved, and the stakes were raised, as the Cuban Missile Crisis highlighted the dangers of nuclear weapons and what these would mean for global conflicts. As a result, the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was enacted on July 25, 1963. A hotline was established between the Kremlin and the White House as well, both showing signs of decreasing tensions between superpowers.
So what exactly did the world learn from Cuba in the period of the Cold War after Stalin? The crisis revealed the dangers in relying on the use of military threats and brinkmanship as methods of resolving conflict. Instead, the value in diplomatic relations triumphed in the successful aversion of the crisis by agreements between leaders Khrushchev and Kennedy. Highlighting both the value and the necessity in the ability to find compromise, Cuba's role in the Cold War was essential in alerting both sides of the gravity of nuclear warfare. The events in Cuba served to show how nuclear weapons posed a greater threat to both powers than one did individually to the other. As a result, both the USA and the USSR realized the immediate need to seek ways to reduce the mutual nuclear threats, as they realized that a nuclear attack on one power could very well mean the destruction of the whole world.
El amor que ya ha pasado no se debe recordar. Fui la ilusión de tu vida.